The dining room glowed under the chandelier, its golden light bouncing off the polished mahogany table and fine porcelain plates. Everything was pristine, perfectly arranged. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being judged. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, her smile as calculated as ever, but it didn't reach her eyes. She gestured toward my plate. "This, my dear, is a recipe I learned from a Michelin star chef. Something special just for you." The words were meant to make me feel welcomed, but they only made my skin crawl. The salad before me was beautiful. Too beautiful. The crisp romaine leaves gleamed under the chandelier, but the dressing had an odd chemical scent to it. I couldn't place it, but it was there, making my stomach twist. Across from me, Chloe was already eating, oblivious to my discomfort. She always was. The family's golden child, the one who could do no wrong. I lifted my fork and took a bite, but I knew something wasn't right. "Try it," Eleanor coaxed, her voice smooth, almost indulgent. "I had you in mind while making it." I hesitated. Then, as if by instinct, I switched plates with Chloe under the table. She didn't notice, lost in her own world, but Eleanor did. Her eyes flicked over to me for just a second too long. I took a bite of Chloe's salad, keeping my expression neutral, but I knew the game had begun. The moment the fork touched my lips, I felt it. The dressing tasted off. It wasn't the sharp bite of vinegar I'd expected. Instead, there was something more chemical about it, something that made my stomach flip in a way that had nothing to do with the flavor. It was subtle, but undeniable. I forced a smile, pretending to enjoy the delicate flavor. But my mind was racing. Why did this feel wrong? I glanced across the table, noticing Chloe finishing her salad with a casual grace, completely unaware of the knot tightening in my gut. She was always like that, effortlessly perfect, untouched by the drama swirling beneath the surface. I envied her that, in a way. But right now, I couldn't focus on her. My attention kept flicking back to the plate in front of me, the greens glistening in the light. No matter how hard I tried to convince myself it was fine, something about this felt like a warning. My eyes shifted back to Eleanor. She was watching me, her gaze intense, as though waiting for some reaction. I met her gaze, my heart hammering in my chest. There was something in her eyes, something unreadable, but it felt like a challenge. My mind screamed at me to be careful. Why did she look so pleased with herself? Then, just as I was about to take another bite, I caught the faintest hint of something moving under my nose. The scent had intensified. I wasn't imagining it. The dressing had a strange tang, one that didn't belong, and just like that, it hit me. Something was wrong with this food. I wasn't paranoid. I wasn't imagining it. The first warning sign had flashed, but now I knew. This wasn't an accident. Before I share what happened next, the moment that made my heart race, I want to take a second to connect with you, my amazing viewers. Where are you watching from? Drop your country's flag in the comments below, because we're about to dive into a tale of deception and manipulation you won't want to miss. And hey, if you've ever been in a situation where you had to trust your instincts, hit that like button. It's about to get intense. I shifted uncomfortably in my chair, trying to steady my breath. The room felt colder now, like the air had shifted without me even realizing it. The fine china, the soft clink of glasses, the hum of polite conversation, it all felt so far away. It was as though the world had narrowed down to the plate in front of me, and the subtle tension between Eleanor and me, an unspoken duel waiting to unfold. I glanced over at Chloe again, but her attention was elsewhere, focused on her phone, probably texting a friend about some new achievement, some new moment to flaunt. I hated how easily she fit in here, how naturally she slid into this world like it was made for her. It wasn't fair. And yet, I couldn't stop myself from trying to figure out if I was simply overreacting, or if my instincts were right, that Eleanor's seemingly gracious gesture was a thinly veiled trap. The more I tried to focus on the conversation around the table, the more I felt my unease grow. The conversation between Daniel and his father, the clinking of silverware, the polite laughter, it all felt so distant, so trivial. All I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears, and all I could see was Eleanor's watchful eyes, calculating every move I made. I couldn't ignore it any longer. The salad in front of me, so meticulously presented, was no longer just food. It had become a symbol of control, a test of whether I would bend to the subtle manipulation at play, a test I wasn't about to fail. Eleanor had been playing her game all evening, and now it was my turn. I had to act, and I had to do it quickly. But how? Then it came to me, an idea, small but powerful, that would turn the tables in my favor. I wasn't going to let her win so easily. No, I had my own way of playing this game. I glanced down at my plate, then over at Chloe. She was too absorbed in her own little world to notice anything unusual. Perfect. With a deliberate movement, I set my fork down, adjusting my napkin as I shifted in my seat. A small, unnoticed movement, but enough for my plate to slide just slightly forward. With a quick, almost imperceptible flick of my wrist, I nudged it far enough for Chloe's plate to take its place. It was simple, elegant even, and yet, it felt like an act of rebellion. I held my breath, keeping my eyes on my plate as I subtly waited for the right moment. I could almost feel Eleanor's eyes on me, calculating, waiting for me to make a mistake. But I wasn't going to make one, not tonight. Chloe, oblivious as ever, continued talking about her latest promotion, her voice light and carefree. She didn't even notice the shift. Her attention was elsewhere, consumed by her own sense of superiority. But Eleanor? She noticed everything. And just as I took a slow sip of water, I caught the briefest flicker in her eyes. The faintest sign that she knew something had changed. I didn't flinch. Instead, I calmly picked up my fork again, the smile on my face a little tighter now. Slowly, I took a bite from the plate Chloe had been eating from. The action was deliberate, meant to send a message to both Chloe and Eleanor, though neither of them would fully understand it yet. I glanced over at Eleanor, meeting her gaze. This time, I didn't look away. She held my stare for a moment, her expression unreadable. But there was something in the way her fingers tightened around her wine glass, something that told me she had already begun to piece it together. I felt a rush of satisfaction. The power had shifted, and Eleanor had just taken her first misstep. She hadn't expected me to fight back this way. She hadn't expected me to see through her carefully constructed game. And that's when I knew it was no longer just about food or family. It was about control. My control. And I was going to hold on to it with everything I had. The minutes passed slowly, each second stretching out like an eternity as I waited, watching the room around me. The conversation had shifted, as it always did at family dinners, into the usual idle chatter about work, vacations, and trivial news. Daniel was still absorbed in his talk with his father, their voices a steady hum in the background, but I wasn't paying attention to them. My mind was focused entirely on Eleanor, and the subtle way her gaze kept drifting back to me, then to Chloe. It was the same look she always wore when she was plotting, when she was controlling the narrative, calculating, waiting for her next move. And then, it happened. Chloe suddenly coughed, a small, delicate sound that at first seemed nothing more than a simple irritation. But then she coughed again, this time more forcefully. The conversation paused momentarily, and all eyes turned toward her, but she waved it off with a careless flick of her hand. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice was thin and strained, as if even she didn't believe her own words. I could feel Eleanor's gaze sharpening, her interest piqued, and I knew she was watching carefully now. The silence hung thick in the air, every second dragging on as Chloe wiped her mouth delicately with her napkin, her face growing paler by the second. Something was happening, something that had been set in motion the moment I switched the plates. It took a moment before Chloe's discomfort was impossible to ignore. Her breathing grew heavier, more erratic, and her once perfect posture slumped slightly, as if the strength had suddenly drained from her body. The smug confidence that usually radiated from her, that air of superiority, was slipping away, replaced by unease. I could see the first signs of panic creeping into her features, but she tried to hide it behind a tight smile. She was no longer pretending to be unaffected. This was real. I watched, feeling a strange rush of satisfaction mix with a deep, dark sense of guilt. The salad, the one Eleanor had meant for me, had been intended as a weapon. But instead it was Chloe who was suffering, and in that moment, I knew that I had won. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Eleanor's carefully laid plan was unraveling before her eyes. She had hoped to see me falter, to watch me become the victim of her quiet manipulation. Instead, Chloe was the one now fighting for control over her body, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she clutched her glass of water. Across the table, Daniel had finally noticed. His eyes flicked to Chloe, concern flooding his face. "Viv, are you okay?" he asked, his voice laced with genuine worry. But Chloe, still struggling to maintain her composure, only nodded weakly. "Yeah, just a bit of a dry throat," she muttered, but the tremble in her voice betrayed her. Eleanor hadn't moved. She remained seated, her fingers still wrapped around the stem of her wine glass, but her eyes were doing the talking now. I saw the way they narrowed, just slightly, as if she were trying to figure out what had gone wrong. And when her gaze flickered back to me, there was something there. A glimmer of realization. She knew that the game had changed. The air in the room grew heavier. I could feel the tension building, the almost suffocating silence that surrounded Chloe's struggle. The once lively dinner had turned into a quiet, suspended moment, and all I could do was watch as Eleanor calculated her next move. But I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing me sweat. Instead, I kept my face impassive, my eyes calmly meeting hers, and I allowed myself a small, barely perceptible smile. Eleanor wasn't in control anymore. Not of me, and not of Chloe either. Chloe's coughing fit continued, each one more forceful than the last, until she finally pushed back from the table, her chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. The sound echoed through the room, cutting through the silence like a knife. She bolted from the room, her movements erratic, her face pale with what I could only assume was more than just a dry throat. I leaned back in my chair, taking a slow sip of water, my gaze still locked on Eleanor, who hadn't moved an inch. The rest of the table sat in stunned silence, and for the first time all evening, I felt the weight of the room's attention pressing down on me. Eleanor's cool exterior had cracked just slightly, just enough for me to see the flicker of unease behind her eyes. She wasn't used to being outmaneuvered, she wasn't used to losing control, and I knew that right then, I had taken the first step in dismantling everything she had so carefully built. The silence that followed Chloe's hasty exit felt almost tangible, a heavy weight pressing down on the room. I could hear the faint sound of her footsteps echoing down the hallway, but even that seemed distant now, swallowed up by the tension in the air. The once lively conversation had died, replaced by a thick, suffocating quiet. All eyes had turned to me, though no one dared speak. Eleanor hadn't moved, still seated at the head of the table, her fingers delicately wrapped around her untouched wine glass. Her gaze, however, was fixed on me with an intensity I hadn't seen before. It was subtle, but I could feel the shift, the tension thickening. Like the calm before a storm. She was studying me now, analyzing every little detail, trying to piece together what had just happened, what had gone wrong. I could almost hear her thoughts racing. She was calculating, as always, trying to regain control of the situation, trying to figure out how I had slipped through her grasp. But she wasn't ready to confront me yet, not directly. Instead, she held her silence, her mask of composure firmly in place. And I, in turn, held mine. The room around us felt frozen, every moment stretched thin. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes flicking between his mother and me, uncertainty written all over his face. He wasn't blind to the tension, he just didn't know how to navigate it. How could he? He'd been trained to ignore the subtle games that unfolded in front of him, to dismiss the quiet power struggles between the women in his life. But now, as he watched the two of us locked in this unspoken battle, I could see the confusion settling in. He didn't understand what was happening, but he could feel it, and he didn't like it. Chloe's absence left a hole in the atmosphere, one that seemed to magnify the weight of everything unsaid. Eleanor, ever the strategist, had to have known what was coming. She had to have sensed that Chloe's reaction wasn't just a coincidence. But instead of reacting, instead of showing any sign of concern for her daughter, Eleanor's gaze remained fixed, her lips pressed into a thin line. She was calculating, thinking 2 steps ahead, trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground. But the damage had already been done. I kept my eyes on my plate, pretending to adjust my napkin, letting the silence stretch just a little longer. The longer she waited, the more it would eat at her. The longer she stayed silent, the more she'd reveal about herself, and I wasn't about to let her off the hook so easily. "Viv," Daniel finally spoke, his voice unsure. He glanced at his mother, then back at me as if trying to find an anchor in the storm. "Is everything okay?" I didn't meet his gaze immediately. Instead, I took a slow sip of water, letting the tension build just a little longer. Then, when I finally looked up, I smiled. It was soft, almost innocent, but it carried the weight of everything that had just transpired. "Of course," I said, my voice smooth, steady. "Just a little bit of spice. Happens sometimes, doesn't it?" My words hung in the air, and I saw Daniel's frown deepen as he tried to process them. He was still confused, still reluctant to see what was happening right in front of him. But Eleanor wasn't so easily fooled. I could see the flicker of something dark in her eyes, a flash of frustration, quickly masked by her usual poise. She knew. She knew I wasn't talking about the dressing anymore. I wasn't talking about the food. I was talking about the game we were playing, the power play that had been set in motion long before dinner had begun. Eleanor slowly placed her wine glass down, her movements deliberate, measured. The sound of the glass against the table was soft, but in the tense silence, it felt like a signal, a call to action. I could almost hear the gears turning in her mind as she shifted in her chair, ready to play her next move. But I wasn't going to make it easy for her. She met my gaze again, this time with a small, controlled smile. "Everything seems to be in order," she said, her voice calm, but the underlying edge was impossible to miss. "I trust you're enjoying your meal." It was the politest of questions, but it wasn't really a question at all. It was a challenge. And I could feel the weight of it, the sharpness behind her seemingly innocent words. She was daring me to reveal myself, daring me to break under the pressure of her silent war. But I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. I smiled back, keeping my tone light, as if we were simply engaging in a casual conversation. "It's lovely," I said. "Quite delicious, actually." Her smile faltered for just a second, an imperceptible slip, but enough to tell me I'd struck a nerve. And there it was, the first crack in her armor. The game had shifted, and for the first time, I had control. It was subtle, a mere flicker of uncertainty in her otherwise perfect facade. But it was there. Eleanor wasn't as invincible as she wanted everyone to believe. She wasn't as untouchable as she thought. And I was just getting started. The conversation around the table had resumed, but it felt different now, more strained. The easy flow of words, the casual laughter, the clink of glasses, it all felt hollow. My mind was elsewhere, focused entirely on the quiet battle unfolding in front of me. I could feel the shift in the room, the subtle change in the dynamics. Eleanor was trying to regain control, her composure only slightly rattled, while Chloe, still pale, tried her best to act as if nothing was wrong. But the facade was starting to crack. Chloe, who had always held a position of favor in this family, no longer looked so untouchable. Her usual smug confidence had evaporated, replaced by something I couldn't quite place: uncertainty, discomfort, maybe even fear. She had been so certain of her place here, so confident that she was the one who had it all figured out. But tonight had shaken her, and I could see it in the way she kept glancing between me and Eleanor, as if trying to figure out where the truth lay. It was subtle at first, but I noticed it. Chloe's eyes kept flicking to her mother, then to me, as though she were trying to decide whose side she was on. She had always been the one who got the praise, the one who could do no wrong. But now I wasn't sure if she was trying to hold on to that image, or if she was beginning to question it. Her silence spoke volumes. Eleanor, on the other hand, seemed to have regained her poise, though the tightness in her jaw betrayed the effort. She continued to sip her wine, her smile cool and polite, but there was an underlying tension in her movements, in the way her eyes never left me for too long. She was waiting for something, I could feel it, waiting for me to slip, to reveal my hand. But I wasn't going to make it that easy for her. The longer the silence stretched, the more I could feel the pull between us, between me and Eleanor, between Chloe and me, between the roles we had played in this family for so long. It was no longer about the meal or the salad, not really. It was about control, about power, and who would ultimately hold it. And in that moment, I felt a shift. I could see it in the way Chloe shifted in her seat, the way she stopped speaking altogether. her usual banter reduced to awkward glances. I could feel it in the air, this new tension between the two of us, her mother and me. It was as if the unspoken lines of loyalty had been drawn, but for the first time, I wasn't the one on the outside looking in. Eleanor's gaze turned briefly toward her daughter, her lips curling into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You look a little pale, darling," she said, her tone soft but insistent. "Perhaps you should rest for a bit." Chloe blinked, her eyes flicking between her mother and me, and I could see the hesitation in her expression. For a brief moment she seemed torn, uncertain. Her usual confidence, that unwavering belief that she was always in control, was slipping. And I knew, without a doubt, that she was beginning to see the cracks in the foundation of the world she had once believed to be unshakable. "I'm fine," Chloe muttered, her voice a little too sharp, a little too defensive. But the way she glanced at me, just a fleeting look but enough to make my heart race, told me everything I needed to know. The walls she had built around herself were beginning to crumble. Eleanor, ever the strategist, quickly masked her disappointment with a practiced smile. "Of course you are," she said, but the coolness in her voice was unmistakable. "You've always been so strong, Viv." It was subtle, but I could feel the shift. The dynamic had changed. Chloe wasn't as untouchable as she had once been, and Eleanor wasn't the all-powerful matriarch she wanted everyone to believe she was. We were no longer just playing the game of family dynamics. We were entering uncharted territory where loyalties could be tested, where even the strongest relationships could unravel under the weight of hidden truths. And I wasn't about to let Eleanor regain control. Not when I knew I had her cornered. As the night wore on, I could feel the power slowly shifting in my favor. Eleanor's attempts to steer the conversation back to safer waters, to regain the upper hand, only made the tension more palpable. She was rattled, and it was only a matter of time before she would reveal just how far she was willing to go to protect her carefully crafted empire. I sat back, watching the scene unfold, my mind already racing ahead to what came next. The silence between Chloe and me was thick now, loaded with unspoken questions, and I could see her grappling with the truth. She wasn't just questioning me anymore, she was questioning everything. And that was exactly what I had wanted. The moment the silence stretched too thin, Eleanor's mask began to slip. It was subtle at first, just the smallest twitch in her jaw, the faintest flicker in her eyes as she glanced between me and Chloe, but I felt it, deep in my bones. The perfect, controlled matriarch was faltering. She was losing her grip, and she knew it. I could almost see her calculating, her mind working overtime, trying to reassert control over the situation. But the more she tried, the more evident it became that the power she once wielded so effortlessly was slipping away from her grasp. Her cool composure, her usual ability to navigate every conversation with precision, was no longer enough. For the first time, I saw fear. Not the kind that makes someone weak, but the kind that makes them desperate. The kind that pushes them to do whatever it takes to regain what's slipping away. "Viv," she said, her voice soft but edged with something colder than I had ever heard before. "Are you feeling all right?" The question wasn't one of concern. It was an interrogation, a calculated probe, looking for any sign of weakness, any sign that I might reveal something that would give her the ammunition she needed to regain control. I didn't flinch. Instead, I met her gaze with a calm smile, letting the tension stretch between us like a taut rope, waiting for it to snap. "I'm fine," I replied, my voice steady. "Just a little tired, I suppose." But the words were empty, and I knew they would be. Eleanor could see through the veneer of my calm. She wasn't fooled by the polite tone. She had to know that I was playing a game of my own, and for once, she wasn't the one in control. Chloe, still pale, shifted in her seat, her movements uncomfortable, restless. She looked between her mother and me, her expression wavering, as if she were torn between the loyalty she had always felt toward Eleanor and the unsettling truth that was creeping into her consciousness. I watched her struggle, silently savoring the shift. She had been the golden child for so long, but now, the cracks in that image were becoming impossible to ignore. The family dynamic was shifting, and I could see it in Chloe's eyes, the question she wasn't yet ready to ask but couldn't stop wondering. Eleanor cleared her throat, trying to regain control of the room, of the conversation. But her words felt hollow, strained. She wasn't herself anymore. She was too aware, too focused on the growing tension between us, to maintain the same level of authority she once did. "Chloe, why don't you go and lie down for a while?" Eleanor suggested, her tone carefully measured but unmistakably sharp, as if she were giving an order disguised as concern. "It's been a long evening." But Chloe didn't move. She hesitated, glancing at me before meeting her mother's eyes. I saw it then, the shift in her posture, the way her shoulders tensed. She was no longer sure of what she had always believed. Her eyes flicked to me again, a look of quiet rebellion forming beneath the surface. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Eleanor's hold on her was weakening, and she knew it. For a long moment, no one spoke. The air in the room felt thick, charged with the unspoken truth that both Chloe and I knew, but Eleanor couldn't bring herself to admit. She had always controlled this family with a quiet, iron grip, but now she was beginning to crack under the pressure. And the longer she held her silence, the more I could feel the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her. She wasn't used to this. She wasn't used to being exposed. "Vivian," Eleanor finally said, her voice laced with something colder, something darker. She said my name as if it were a warning, a quiet threat. "You think you've won something, don't you?" Her words, though calm, carried a weight that could shatter glass. I felt a chill run through me, but I didn't flinch. Instead, I leaned in slightly, my gaze unwavering. "No," I said softly, almost sympathetically. "I'm just getting started." Her eyes narrowed, her lips pressing together into a thin line. The slightest tremor ran through her fingers as she adjusted her glass, her grip tightening around the stem. She was on the edge now, and I could see it. I could see her trying to maintain that veneer of control, but it was slipping away, little by little. In that moment, I knew that I had won. Not completely, not yet, but enough. Eleanor's reign was no longer unquestioned. Her carefully constructed empire was showing signs of weakness, and the foundation that she had built over years was beginning to crumble. It wasn't going to be easy. I knew that much, but I was prepared to finish what had been started. The room was still, suspended in the tension that hung between us, and I knew this was just the beginning. But for the first time, Eleanor didn't hold all the cards. She had miscalculated. She had underestimated me. And now, the real game was about to begin. Eleanor's control was slipping, and with each passing moment, I could feel the tension in the room thicken, coiling tighter around her, around all of us. The once perfect facade she had so carefully crafted, that air of calm superiority she had worn like armor, was no longer holding. It was in the way her hand trembled just slightly as she lifted her glass, in the way her gaze flickered between Chloe and me, searching for any sign that the pieces were falling into place. But I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. Not yet. I watched her, waiting, letting her stew in the realization that she was no longer in control. The silence was palpable, a weight that hung over the table, and I could sense her growing unease. For the first time, she was the one who didn't know what to do next. I could feel it in the way her shoulders tensed, the way her lips pressed together in a thin, forced smile. She was calculating, trying to figure out how to reclaim the narrative, how to fix the cracks in the carefully constructed image she had spent years building. But this time, I was one step ahead. Chloe, still quiet, still pale, shifted in her seat, her eyes darting between me and her mother. I could see the gears turning in her head, the shift in her loyalties that was no longer as simple as it had been before. She wasn't as sure of her place in this family anymore. She wasn't as certain of where her allegiance lay, and I knew it was only a matter of time before she realized that she had been a pawn in her mother's game all along. The moment felt like a breath caught in the chest, suspended in time, and I knew it was the perfect opportunity. The moment when the pieces fell into place. The moment when everything changed. I leaned forward, my voice low but steady. "Eleanor," I said, watching her carefully, "you've always been in control, haven't you? But the truth is you've spent your whole life building walls, keeping everyone around you at a distance. You've controlled everything, every conversation, every decision, every moment. But you're not controlling this anymore. Not now." Her eyes flickered with something. Was it panic or anger? It didn't matter. She couldn't hide it. The cracks were growing wider. "I'm not the one you need to worry about," I continued, my gaze unwavering. "Chloe is. And you know it." You've always thought she was the perfect daughter, the perfect heir to everything you've built. But now she sees you for what you are." Chloe's head jerked up at the mention of her name, her eyes wide, confused. She hadn't been expecting this. She hadn't been expecting me to speak the truth so plainly. Her mother's grip on her, the invisible chains that had held her for so long, were starting to loosen, and I could see the fear, real fear, begin to settle in. Eleanor opened her mouth, probably to defend herself, to reassert her dominance. But I wasn't going to let her. I wasn't going to let her smooth everything over with a well-timed smile and a few choice words. Not this time. "You see," I said, my voice gaining strength with each word, "you've been hiding behind your perfect little world, your perfect little family. But it's all just a facade, and Chloe is starting to realize that." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. The silence stretched between us like a taut rope, and for a moment, I could almost see the walls cracking, piece by piece. Eleanor's eyes darkened, but there was no more calm, no more control. Only the simmering rage beneath the surface, barely held together by threads. Chloe's eyes flicked to me, then to her mother, and I could see the internal battle playing out in her. She was torn between the mother she had always idolized and the truth she could no longer deny. She was beginning to understand that the empire Eleanor had built wasn't as unshakable as it seemed, and that, in itself, was a powerful thing. Because once the truth was out, once it started to sink in, there was no going back. Chloe stood up abruptly, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. She turned to her mother, her voice shaking but strong. "I need to think," she said, her words like a quiet declaration of war. And just like that, she walked away, leaving Eleanor in stunned silence. The table remained still, the air thick with the unspoken truth of what had just happened. Eleanor was alone now. For the first time, she was on the outside, no longer the queen of this family, no longer the untouchable matriarch she had once been. I sat back, a slow smile tugging at the corners of my lips. The final move had been made. The game had changed, and I had taken control. Eleanor's empire was crumbling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. After Chloe left the room, the atmosphere in the dining hall thickened, and a heavy silence filled the space. Eleanor sat there, her face unreadable, her hands gripping her wineglass a little too tightly, though she made no move to address what had just happened. But I knew better. Beneath that calm exterior, she was unraveling just like everything else around us. I could feel Daniel's eyes on me, but I didn't acknowledge him. He had been silent all evening, absorbing everything but not understanding the weight of the situation. The quiet tension between Eleanor and me was now palpable, and he, the man caught between the two women in his life, didn't know where to place his loyalty. His discomfort was obvious, but I wasn't here for his approval. I focused on Eleanor, watching her carefully. The woman who had ruled this house with an iron fist, who had orchestrated every move, every word, was slipping. The composure was still there, but it was faltering, cracking at the edges. She was thinking, calculating, trying to find a way to fix what was happening, but it was too late. The pieces were already falling into place. Chloe returned moments later, walking back into the room slowly, her face pale, eyes downcast. She paused at the door, as though considering whether or not she should speak. I could feel the weight of her thoughts in the air, her struggle with her own role in this family, the loyalty that was now eroding away under the strain of the truth. Eleanor, sensing an opportunity to regain control, spoke first, her voice too calm, too measured. "Chloe," she said, her tone almost soothing, "you should sit down. It's been a long evening. I think you need some rest." But Chloe didn't sit. Instead, she walked to the center of the room, her eyes not meeting Eleanor's, her hands trembling slightly. She stood there for a long moment, the tension between the two of them thick enough to choke on. "Mom," Chloe said, her voice breaking just slightly, "I know what you've been doing. I know what you've been hiding from me all this time." Eleanor's expression didn't change, but I saw the flicker in her eyes, the smallest shift, just enough to show that she hadn't expected this. She had never expected Chloe, her perfect daughter, to turn on her. Chloe's voice grew steadier. "I don't want to be part of your game anymore. You've kept me in the dark for too long, and I'm not going to be your pawn anymore." The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment there was nothing but silence. Eleanor's grip on her glass tightened, and I could see the anger beginning to bubble under her composed exterior. But Chloe wasn't backing down. She was finally seeing her mother for who she really was, a manipulator who had controlled everything, from the smallest details to the largest decisions. "Chloe, you don't know what you're saying," Eleanor said, her voice low, trying to regain some authority. But her words lacked conviction. She was losing ground. She knew it, and now Chloe knew it too. I couldn't help but feel a surge of satisfaction. Chloe was waking up to the truth, and Eleanor was losing control of her favorite weapon, the illusion of perfection. This wasn't just about power anymore. It was about breaking free from the chains Eleanor had wrapped around everyone for so long. Chloe didn't flinch. She stood her ground, eyes finally meeting her mother's with defiance. "I do know what I'm saying, Mum. I'm done being in your shadow. I'm done being your puppet." Eleanor opened her mouth to argue, to manipulate, but there was no more fight left in her. The truth was out. She could no longer pretend. The family was starting to see her for what she was, a woman who built her empire on lies and control. I turned to Daniel, who was sitting in silence, his eyes flicking between his mother and his sister. The conflict in his gaze was evident. He had always been the passive observer, but now, with the truth in front of him, he was beginning to realize the depth of the manipulation, the control his mother had exerted over everything and everyone. The realization was dawning on him, slow and painful. "Daniel," I said softly, my voice calm but filled with intent. "This is bigger than us. You need to understand that your mother won't let go of her control easily. She will fight to keep her power, no matter the cost." He didn't respond right away. His gaze dropped to the table, his thoughts racing, but I could see the struggle inside him. He was torn between loyalty to his family and the truth that was now staring him in the face. The battle for control in this room was no longer just about Eleanor and me. It was about Chloe finding her voice, about Daniel finally seeing the woman he had blindly trusted for so long. The dynamics had shifted, and as the seconds ticked by, I knew this was the moment when everything could change. Chloe looked back at me, and I saw something in her eyes, something that hadn't been there before. Determination, the beginning of a shift, a realization that she was stronger than she thought. She had broken free from her mother's influence, and now she had a choice to make. This was it. The final move had been made. Eleanor's empire was crumbling, and there was no going back. The silence in the room was deafening. Chloe's words had hung in the air like a heavy weight, and now there was nothing but the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Eleanor sat perfectly still, her fingers still curled around her glass, but the grip had gone from tight to almost fragile. She was no longer the commanding presence she once was. The power she had wielded for so long had started to slip, piece by piece, like sand falling through her fingers. Chloe stepped back from the table, her posture straight, her expression unyielding. She wasn't the girl I had once known, always playing the role of the perfect daughter. She had made her choice, and she wasn't afraid anymore. There was no hesitation in her eyes when she met mine. It was as though she had finally seen the truth, and in that moment, it had set her free. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice low, cold, and calculated. "You don't know what you're doing, Chloe. This is not the way to handle things. You're making a mistake." Her words were nothing more than empty threats, hollow and weak. I could see through them now. There was no more strength in her tone, no more authority. She had always controlled everything, every conversation, every action. But now she was scrambling, trying to claw back whatever little influence she still had. But Chloe wasn't listening. She had heard enough. She had seen enough. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," Chloe said, her voice steady but her words sharp as daggers. "I won't be your pawn any longer." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. But there was something different about them now. It was no longer the calculating gaze of a woman who could control everyone around her. It was desperation. It was the look of someone realizing they had lost. I took a deep breath, letting the weight of the moment settle around me. This was it. The point of no return. Eleanor's empire had crumbled, and there was no getting it back. It wasn't just about Chloe or me anymore. It was about the power, the manipulation, and the way Eleanor had kept everyone in line for so long. But no longer. The silence that had once been her weapon was now her downfall. Daniel's voice broke through the tension, soft but full of uncertainty. "Chloe, what's happening here? Why now?" His words were almost pleading, as though he couldn't understand why his family was unraveling before his eyes. His gaze was fixed on Chloe, the woman he had always thought was beyond reproach, and the woman who had always been on his side. But now, the truth was too clear, and it was a truth that neither of us could deny anymore. I turned my attention to him, my tone soft but firm. "Daniel, you've seen it too. You've known all along. It's just that you didn't want to see it. Your mother, she's been controlling this family for years, using manipulation and fear to keep everyone in line. She's not who you think she is." Daniel's face flushed, and I could see the weight of the words hitting him. For the first time, I saw doubt in his eyes. He had always been the protector, the one who tried to keep the peace. But now, the peace was shattered, and there was no going back. "You knew?" he whispered, his voice barely audible, as if the very thought of it was too much to bear. "All this time?" I nodded slowly, my gaze unwavering. "Yes, and now you have a choice. You can stay blind to the truth or you can face it, but understand this. Eleanor's control over you, over all of us, is over. It ends tonight." Eleanor didn't respond. She couldn't. The words had been said, and the truth had come to light. The silence that followed was deafening. No one moved, no one spoke. It was as though the entire world had paused, waiting for the next step. And then, with a suddenness that took us all by surprise, Chloe turned to her mother. "I'm done," she said quietly, her voice firm. "I'm done with living in your shadow. I don't need your approval. I don't need your lies anymore. I'm making my own path, and I won't be part of your game." Eleanor stared at her for a long moment, her face unreadable. She was fighting it, I could see that. She was trying to hold on to her last shred of control, trying to make Chloe doubt her own decision. But Chloe wasn't wavering. The transformation in her had already been made. "Go ahead, Chloe," Eleanor said, her voice cold, barely a whisper now. "But remember this. When you choose to walk away from me, there's no turning back. You'll lose everything." Chloe took a deep breath, her gaze steady as she looked at her mother one last time. "I've already lost everything, Mom, and I'm better off without it." Without another word, Chloe turned and walked out of the room. She didn't look back. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and I felt a rush of finality settle over the room. Eleanor sat there, motionless, her face pale, her eyes blank. She hadn't moved, hadn't said a word since Chloe left. The rein she had held so tightly to, the control she had commanded for years, was gone. And now she was left in the silence of her own making. I stood up slowly, turning to Daniel. He was still sitting there, staring at the spot where Chloe had just stood, his face a mixture of confusion and grief. "I'm sorry," he said softly, his voice heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. I nodded, but there were no words to offer. There was nothing left to say. The battle had been fought, and we had all been changed in the process. The empire that Eleanor had so carefully built was no more. And for the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace. Because now, the future was ours to decide. The air in the room was thick with the aftermath of Chloe's departure. Eleanor remained frozen in place, her eyes distant, her body rigid. It was as if she were trying to hold on to the last threads of the world she had built, refusing to let it slip completely out of her reach. But the truth was, the empire she had worked so hard to control was falling apart before her eyes, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. I stood there, watching her, waiting for some kind of reaction. But Eleanor didn't move, didn't speak. The silence was suffocating, oppressive. It wasn't the silence of calm. It was the silence of defeat. I could feel it hanging in the air, the weight of it pressing down on me as much as it was pressing down on her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Eleanor broke the silence, her voice soft, almost fragile. "You think you've won, don't you?" she said, her words laced with bitterness. But there was something else, something I couldn't quite place. It was like the last remnants of her pride were crumbling away. I didn't answer her right away. Instead, I walked slowly to the window, my eyes scanning the view of the garden outside. It was peaceful out there, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in here. And I realized, for the first time in so long, that I had stepped out of the shadow of this family's control. I had stepped out from beneath Eleanor's suffocating grip. Turning back to her, I finally spoke. "No, Eleanor, I don't think I've won," I said, my voice steady, unwavering. "But you've lost. And that's something you'll have to live with. It's something I'm sure you'll never truly accept." Her eyes flashed with anger, but it was a fleeting thing, gone as quickly as it appeared. She looked defeated, and I could see it in the way her shoulders sagged, the way her face hardened with the weight of a truth she couldn't deny. She had tried to manipulate everyone in this family. She had tried to control every aspect of our lives, and now, for the first time, she was completely powerless. I took a step closer to her, not in aggression, but in quiet understanding. "You've spent so long controlling every piece of this family, Eleanor, but in the end, you lost the most important part. You lost us. You lost your own daughter." Her lips trembled, the stoic mask she had worn for so long beginning to crack. For the first time, I saw something in her eyes that I hadn't seen before. Vulnerability. It was fleeting, but it was there. The realization that the game was over, that her power had faded into nothing, and there was no going back. "Chloe will never forgive you," I added, my voice soft but firm, "and neither will I." Eleanor opened her mouth, but no words came out. She wasn't capable of defending herself anymore. Not against the truth. Not against the reality that she had lost. The empire she had spent her life building was crumbling at her feet, and now there was no way to rebuild it. I turned toward the door, my footsteps heavy on the polished floor. I didn't need to say anything more. There was no point in explaining. The truth had already been laid bare. As I stepped into the hallway, I saw Chloe standing at the end, her back to me. She hadn't gone far. She was just waiting, uncertain, still processing everything. I walked over to her slowly, feeling the weight of the moment between us. "You did the right thing," I said softly, my voice steady. "It's over now. You don't have to carry her burdens anymore." Chloe turned, her eyes searching mine, and I could see the uncertainty, the fear, but also something else. There was relief in her gaze, the first real sign that she was beginning to let go of the weight she had carried for so long. "I'm scared," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "What happens now? What do I do now?" I smiled, a small, reassuring smile. "You live your life. You choose your own path. For the first time, you have the freedom to decide what you want, what you need." And in that moment, I saw it, the transformation. Chloe wasn't the same person she had been when she walked into that room. She had broken free from the chains that had bound her, and she had made the hardest decision of her life, one that would change everything. "I don't know what the future holds," she said, her voice still uncertain. "But I know I can face it now." I nodded, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We all can." As we stood there in the quiet of the hallway, I knew that everything had changed. The family dynamic had been irrevocably altered, and what came next was uncertain. But I also knew that this was the first step toward freedom. Freedom from Eleanor's control, freedom for Chloe, for me, and for everyone who had been caught in her web of manipulation. We had faced the truth. We had broken free. And now the future was ours to shape. As the quiet stretched between us, Chloe and I shared a moment of mutual understanding. The weight of everything that had happened settling in the air around us. The silence was no longer oppressive. It was the silence of a new beginning. A chance to finally breathe after years of being suffocated by Eleanor's grip. Chloe looked at me, her eyes searching for reassurance, still unsure of what lay ahead. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice tinged with both fear and hope. I took a deep breath, the air filling my lungs with a kind of calm I hadn't felt in years. The truth was, I didn't have all the answers. No one did. But for the first time, we had the power to choose, and that was more than I could have ever hoped for. "We move forward," I said, my voice steady, though there was a softness to it now. "We build something new. For ourselves. No more games. No more manipulation." Chloe nodded slowly, as if the words were finally sinking in, as if she were beginning to believe them herself, and I saw the spark of something in her eyes, something that had been missing before. Confidence. The beginning of freedom. We stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the family's history pressing down on us, but also the promise of something better ahead. Eleanor's reign had come to an end, but the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be hurdles, there would be setbacks, but we would face them together, on our own terms. Just then, Daniel emerged from the living room, his face a mix of confusion and resignation. He had been silent through much of the confrontation, but now, it seemed like he had finally come to terms with what had happened, with the truth that had been so carefully hidden from him for years. He looked at us, his gaze lingering on Chloe, then turning to me. There was no hiding it now. He saw the change, the shift in the family dynamic, and for the first time I could see a flicker of understanding in his eyes. The blind loyalty he had once had for his mother was fading, replaced by something far more uncertain. Something I hadn't seen in him before, doubt. "I didn't know," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper, as though speaking louder might make it more real. "I didn't know any of this. I didn't know how deep it went." Chloe stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "It's not your fault, Daniel," she said. "You didn't see it because you didn't want to. We all were blind to it in some way. But it's done now." He swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling in his chest. I always thought I was protecting you, that I was doing the right thing. But now," he trailed off, his voice faltering. "You were protecting a lie," I said softly, my tone steady but not unkind. "And that's not your fault. But it's time to let it go. We can't keep living in the past. Not anymore." He looked at me, and for the first time I saw the crack in his armor. The man who had always seemed so sure of himself, so steadfast in his beliefs, was suddenly unsure. His world had been turned upside down in one evening. And now he had to rebuild it, just like the rest of us. "I don't know what's next," he admitted, his voice raw. "But I know one thing. I can't be a part of this anymore, not the way it was." I nodded. "That's all any of us can do. We can't change the past, Daniel, but we can make sure the future is different." Chloe stepped closer to him, her hand reaching out to rest lightly on his arm. There was a softness in her eyes, an understanding that hadn't been there before. "We're not the same people we were," she said, her voice quiet but strong. "And that's okay. We can rebuild. We can be better." For a moment, Daniel stood still, absorbing her words, and then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. He wasn't fully there yet, but I could see the beginning of something. A shift in him, too, maybe the first step toward freeing himself from his mother's influence. "We all have a choice now," I said, my voice carrying a weight of finality. "We decide what happens next. Not Eleanor, not anyone else. Just us." As I spoke, I felt something inside me settle, a calm certainty that, despite the chaos, despite the destruction, we were heading in the right direction. Eleanor had ruled with fear for too long, but that was over now. The future was ours to define. The family, fractured though it may have been, was starting to rebuild itself, one piece at a time. And I was ready to see where this new path would take us. The next few days passed in a blur. The house, once full of tension and calculated games, now felt oddly quiet. There was an uncomfortable stillness in the air, but it was a different kind of quiet, one that promised change, that carried the weight of unspoken decisions. We were all trying to find our footing, trying to figure out what this new version of our family looked like. Chloe and I had spent more time together in the past week than we ever had before. It wasn't easy for either of us. She was still processing everything, the years of manipulation, the lies, the quiet way she had been kept in her mother's shadow. And I, too, was grappling with the realization that this was the beginning of something entirely new, a chance to rebuild from the ruins. But it wasn't just about the two of us. It was about Daniel, too. He had retreated into himself, lost in the confusion of everything he had just discovered. I could see the conflict in his eyes when he looked at us. He was torn between the family he had always known and the painful truth that had suddenly been thrust upon him. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but I knew that eventually he'd have to face what had been done. One evening, after dinner, I found myself sitting in the living room, quietly reading a book, when Daniel walked in. He paused in the doorway, his eyes scanning the room as if he were trying to figure out how to approach me, or whether to approach me at all. He hadn't said much in the past few days, and the silence between us felt heavier with each passing hour. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet but filled with a raw sincerity that caught me off guard. "Vivian," he said, and I looked up at him. "I've been thinking." I didn't say anything at first, just waited for him to continue. His eyes were steady now, no longer filled with the confusion I'd seen before, but there was still a lingering sadness in them. A sadness that came from facing the truth. "I want to make things right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I haven't been the partner you needed, the family member you needed. I let my mother control everything, and I let it tear us apart." I felt a knot tighten in my chest. I hadn't expected this. I hadn't expected him to take responsibility for any of it. But there it was, an acknowledgement, a shift in him. And for the first time in a long time, I saw the man I had married. Not the man who had been blindly loyal to his mother, but the man who was willing to face his own mistakes. "I don't know how to fix everything," he continued, his voice wavering just slightly. "But I'm here, and I want to try." I closed the book in my lap and set it aside, my gaze steady. "It's not just about fixing things, Daniel. It's about building something new, and we can't do that if we're still holding on to the past." He nodded slowly, as if my words were sinking in, as if he were finally understanding the magnitude of what I was saying. "I know," he said quietly, "but I'm willing to do whatever it takes, for you, for us." There was no more hesitation in his voice now. No more uncertainty, just a man ready to move forward, to face the new reality. And as I looked at him, I realized that we both had a long road ahead of us, but maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. Maybe we could rebuild, not just as a family, but as individuals who had learned from the past, not let it define us. Chloe came into the room just then, her presence as quiet as ever, but there was a new confidence in her step. She had started to take back her life, to take back her power, and I could see it in the way she held herself now. No longer the timid, uncertain girl she once was. She was someone new, stronger, more aware of her worth. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice soft but filled with sincerity. "For everything. For not seeing it sooner. For not standing up." I stood up and walked over to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "It's okay. You didn't know, but you do now, and that's what matters." Daniel watched the exchange between us, his gaze shifting from me to Chloe and back again, and for the first time, I saw him begin to understand. To see the changes we were both going through, the changes we had already begun to make. "We'll get through this," I said, my voice steady, filled with a quiet certainty. "Together. But we can't do it alone. We have to be honest with each other. We have to be willing to face the truth, even when it hurts." Chloe nodded. "I know," she said quietly, but there was something different in her tone now, something stronger. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. The road ahead wasn't easy, but it was ours to walk. And as a family, we would walk it together, even if it meant tearing down the old walls and building something new from the ground up. Eleanor's empire was gone, but the family we had left behind, what it could become, was something I was willing to fight for. As the days went by, the house started to feel less like a battleground and more like a place we could rebuild from. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but the air was lighter, the tension that had once gripped everything slowly starting to dissipate. We were all trying to find our new normal, trying to navigate this unfamiliar terrain of honesty, openness, and self-awareness. Chloe and I spent more time together than we ever had before. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of awkwardness, moments where we both had to face the weight of the years of manipulation and control that had shaped our lives. But each conversation we had, each moment of vulnerability, was a step towards something new. Something real. We went for walks around the property, talking about everything and nothing at all. It was during one of these walks that Chloe stopped suddenly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "You know," she said, her voice thoughtful, "I used to think I needed to be perfect, that if I did everything right, I'd get approval. From Mum, from everyone. But now..." She trailed off, glancing at me, her expression conflicted. "I don't know who I am without all of that." I watched her carefully, understanding the weight of her words. You're still you, Chloe. You always have been. You just didn't see it because you were too busy trying to fit into someone else's mold. But now you have the chance to define yourself, to figure out who you want to be. She nodded slowly as if the idea was both liberating and terrifying. It's just hard. I've been living my whole life for someone else's vision. I don't even know where to start. I smiled softly, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Start with what makes you happy. Start with the things that make you feel free, without worrying about anyone else's expectations. You don't have to have it all figured out right now. Just take it one step at a time. Chloe's lips quirked into a small smile, and I could see the weight lifting from her shoulders, even if only a little. I guess I'm learning that it's okay to not know. We continued walking, side by side, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the need to rush. There was no clock ticking, no pressure to fix everything in an instant. We were moving forward, together, at our own pace. Later that evening, I found myself in the living room with Daniel. He had finally begun to open up more, his quiet reflection giving way to moments of honesty. It wasn't easy for him. He had spent years buried under his mother's influence, but now he was slowly peeling back the layers. He was beginning to confront the uncomfortable truths that had been hidden from him for so long. He sat across from me, his eyes searching mine. I don't know how to make up for the years I spent ignoring everything, he said quietly, his voice filled with regret. For not seeing how much my mother was controlling, how much damage it did to you. To Chloe. I held up a hand, stopping him. You don't have to make up for anything, Daniel. You can't change the past. But you can choose what happens now. His gaze dropped to his hands, the weight of his thoughts evident in his posture. I don't know where to begin, he admitted. You start by being present, I said, my voice firm but gentle. Start by listening, by seeing things for what they are, and you'll find your way. We all will. He nodded, but I could see the uncertainty still lingering in his eyes. The road ahead was long for him, just as it was for Chloe. But I knew, deep down, that the change was happening. It was slow, but it was happening. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had led up to this moment. Eleanor's empire was gone, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. The house was no longer a place of tension and manipulation. It was a place where we could choose who we were, free from the shadow of someone else's expectations. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be struggles, there would be moments of doubt, and we'd have to rebuild trust and understanding with each other. But we had taken the first step, and that to me was enough. The next morning, as I sat at the kitchen table with Chloe and Daniel, a quiet sense of peace settled over me. We were still figuring things out, but for the first time, I saw the possibility of a future that wasn't dictated by fear or control. A future that belonged to us, to the people we chose to be, not the ones others had tried to make us. I smiled at Daniel and Chloe, the weight of everything that had happened not fully gone, but lighter now, easier to bear. The road ahead was ours to walk, and for the first time in a long time, I had hope that we'd walk it together. As the days passed, the house began to feel more like a home than a battleground. The wounds we had all carried for so long were healing, not in an instant, but with every honest conversation, every step we took toward understanding one another. Eleanor's grip on our lives had finally loosened, and though it wasn't easy, we were slowly rebuilding what had been broken. Chloe, Daniel, and I, each of us finding our own way, but connected by the shared experience of breaking free from the past. We didn't have all the answers. We didn't know what the future would hold. But one thing was certain. We had control over our own destinies now. No more manipulation, no more lies. Just us, standing together, ready to face whatever came next. As we gathered around the table for dinner one evening, the quiet tension that had once defined our family was gone. There was laughter now, real laughter, a sound I hadn't heard in years. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. And as I looked at my family, I realized that sometimes the hardest battles are the ones that lead us to the greatest freedom. Before I end this story, I want to take a moment to thank each of you for watching. If you've been following along, you've seen the twists, the turns, and the ultimate triumph of breaking free from the chains of control. It's a powerful reminder that we all have the strength to take back what's ours and rebuild when things fall apart. If you want to see more stories like this, filled with raw emotion, powerful moments, and unexpected twists, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Join the community, share your thoughts, and be part of this journey. Thank you again for being here, and I'll see you in the next story.